Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place at the heart of everything, a world so ancient and so layered in darkness that even the people who live on it do not understand what lies beneath their feet. Most of the trillions of souls who call themselves citizens of the Imperium of man will never visit it. Many of them will never even think about it beyond a vague religious reverence, the way one might think about a god they were taught to fear rather than understand. It is the throne world. It is Terra. And underneath it, behind doors that have not been opened in centuries, sometimes in millennia, something waits. The question we are going to sit with today is a quiet one. It is not the kind of question that gets asked loudly in the great gilded halls of the imperial palace, sure, where cardinals and lords debate the fate of 10,000 worlds and custodians stand motionless as gold statues against the walls. It is the kind of question you might ask in a low voice, the kind of question that earns a very long pause before anyone attempts an answer. Why does nobody open the sealed vaults on Terra? Not the decorative ones, not the reliquaries full of honored Space Marine chapter standards, or the archival chambers stuffed with administrative records going back 40 generations. I mean the other ones. The ones guarded by beings who have stood watch for 100 years without sleeping. The ones locked behind doors made of adamantium, reinforced with psychic wards and sanctic circles. The ones so deep beneath the imperial palace that the air itself feels wrong. They're charged with something the human nervous system recognizes as danger before the conscious mind can catch up. The ones that contain things that, according to the best sources available within the Imperium, could annihilate the entire human race if they were ever let out. Nobody opens those, and when you stop to really think about that, it becomes one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. So let us descend together. Let us go deep. Let us follow the corridors downward, past the bureaucrats and the pilgrims and the priests, past the custodians standing their golden vigil, past the places where torches and lumo globes still burn, and into the places where light has not reached in 10,000 years. We are going to explore every layer of this mystery, from the architecture of the imperial palace down to the philosophical heart of what it means to know something so dangerous that knowing it is itself an act of violence against the mind. Because the answer to why nobody opens the vaults is not simple. It is not just fear, though fear is certainly present in enormous quantities. It is not just ignorance, though ignorance plays its role in ways both terrible and almost merciful. The real answer is something richer and stranger and more deeply human than either of those things. It touches on the nature of the Emperor himself, on a catastrophe 10,000 years in the making, on ancient horrors from an era so dark that even the Imperium calls it the Old Night, and on a slow-motion disaster that is still unfolding as you read these words. Pull up something comfortable. This is going to take a while, and I promise you, by the time we surface from these depths, you will understand Terra in a way you probably did not before. Let us begin, as so many things in this universe must begin, with a sense of scale. When most people think about Warhammer 40,000, they think about the battles, the Space Marines crashing down in their drop pods, the vast grinding war engines of the Adeptus Mechanicus striding across alien landscapes, the hordes of chaos pressing against the walls of besieged cities, while defenders fire until their ammunition runs dry, and then use their weapons as clubs, and then die with their hands around the throats of the things that killed them. All of that is real. All of that is part of the universe. But the 40K universe is also built on a quieter kind of horror. That the horror of things that are not battles at all, that are older and stranger, and in some ways more frightening than any war, because at least wars can end. The sealed vaults of Terra are that quieter horror. They are the Imperium's way of saying, we have encountered something we cannot defeat, cannot destroy, cannot understand, cannot safely face, and so we have done the only remaining thing. We have put a door between it and ourselves, and we have made sure the door never opens. That is not a victory. That is not even a ceasefire. That is something closer to an acknowledgement of limitation, a kind of institutional humility that the Imperium rarely displays, but which, in this specific context, has been its saving grace. Understanding why those doors must stay closed requires understanding what they contain. Yeah, and understanding what they contain requires understanding the history that put those things there. So let us start with the world itself. Part 1. Terra, the planet that became a prison. To understand why the vaults are sealed, you first need to understand what Terra is and how it came to be the way it is. Because Terra is not simply the capital of a galaxy-spanning empire, the way ancient Rome was the capital of its empire, or the way a modern nation might have a seat of government. Terra is something far stranger and more terrible than that. Terra is a world that has been continuously inhabited, continuously built upon, continuously scarred and layered and buried under its own history for such an incomprehensible span of time that what we call the 41st millennium barely scratches the surface of it. Think about that for a moment. Yeah, the Imperium of man, the civilization we think of when we hear the name Warhammer 40,000, has existed for approximately 10,000 years. To most human beings living in the 41st millennium, 10,000 years is essentially forever. It is the entirety of their known history, stretching back to a mythologized founding event so distant that most ordinary people understand it only through religious allegory rather than any kind of accurate historical record. But 10,000 years of the Imperium is only the most recent chapter in Terra's story, and it is not even the most interesting one. Before the Imperium, there was the Great Crusade, when the Emperor first led his armies out from Terra and began to reunite humanity across the galaxy. Before that, there were the Unification Wars, when the Emperor himself emerged from what the lore describes as a very deliberate kind of obscurity and began the process of defeating the techno-barbarian warlords who had carved Terra into a patchwork of brutal, feudal city-states. Before that, there was the Age of Strife, which lasted for thousands of years, a period so catastrophic and so dark that the people living through it had no way of knowing whether humanity as a species would survive it at all. And before even that, there was the Dark Age of technology, which was apparently an era of genuine wonder and achievement, of human civilization spread across the stars in ways that have not been matched since. By the time the Imperium as we understand it exists, and Terra has already been carrying the weight of human history for something in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000 years, depending on how you count. The result is a world that is not so much a planet as a geological accumulation of civilizations. Every previous era of human existence has left its mark on Terra, and those marks go down. When you dig into Terra, you are not digging into rock, you are digging into history, and the deeper you go, the older and stranger things become. The Imperial Palace itself is the most extreme expression of this phenomenon. It is not a building in any conventional sense. It is a city-sized complex that sprawls across what was once the Himalayan mountain range of old Earth, a structure so vast that it has its own weather systems inside some of its larger domes, or that its outer walls rise half a mile high and span 100 feet thick in places, and that its sublevels dig into the bedrock of Terra for hundreds of miles. The depths of the Imperial Palace are so far below the surface that they exist in a kind of geological twilight, where the pressure of all that rock and history presses in from every direction, and the air has not naturally circulated in millennia. And throughout that enormous depth, sealed and forgotten and deliberately kept that way, are the vaults. Some of them predate the Imperial Palace itself. Some of them predate the Unification Wars. Some of them may predate the Age of Strife, which means they could contain things that were locked away anywhere from 5 to 10,000 years before the Imperium was even founded. Nobody knows exactly how many sealed chambers exist beneath the Imperial Palace, because the complete schematics of the structure have never existed in a single place, or in a form that any one person or organization could fully comprehend. The Adeptus Custodes, who are responsible for the security of the palace, are described in lore as the only beings who know all of the palace's levels and passages, And even that claim has to be taken with a degree of uncertainty. The Imperial Palace has been built, destroyed, rebuilt, expanded, modified, buried, excavated, and modified again over such an enormous span of time that it has transcended the concept of being a designed structure. It has become something more like a geological formation that happens to have corridors. This matters because it means that when we talk about the sealed vaults of Terra, we are not talking about a simple list of rooms somewhere. We are talking about an unknown number of spaces, of varying sizes, sealed at varying points in history for varying reasons, many of which are no longer recorded or understood by anyone currently alive. Some of those spaces were sealed by the Emperor himself. Some were sealed by Malcador, the Sigillite, who served as something like the Emperor's closest advisor and regent. Some were sealed by the custodians during the Age of Strife, when they were apparently fighting and capturing things that defied conventional description. Some were probably sealed by people whose names and reasons have been entirely lost to history. The cumulative effect is a planet that is, at its deepest levels, one enormous archive of secrets that humanity has decided, for 1,000 different reasons spanning tens of thousands of years, it cannot afford to know. And here is the part that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up a little. Of all the sealed vaults on Terra, the ones that are most carefully guarded are not the ones containing lost technology or dangerous weapons or forbidden books. The ones that receive the most dedicated and intense attention from the Adeptus Custodes are the ones containing things that are still alive. Part 2. The Imperial Palace and its layers of secrets. Walking into the Imperial Palace from the outside is already an exercise in deliberately orchestrated awe. The architecture is designed to make you feel small, and it succeeds with a kind of ruthless efficiency that only 10,000 years of continuous refinement can produce. The outer walls are covered with statuary on a scale that beggars description. Angels and primarchs and nameless warriors frozen in stone and metal, each of them the size of a hab block, looking down on the endless streams of pilgrims and officials and soldiers with expressions of serene, timeless authority. The gates are massive enough to dwarf titans. The plazas inside the outer walls can hold millions of people and still not feel crowded. All of this is intentional. The Imperial Palace is not just a building or even just a city. It is an instrument of psychological control, a physical argument for the supremacy and permanence of the Imperium of man, constructed to impress and awe anyone who enters it. A pilgrim from some dusty agri-world at the far edge of the segmentum, who has travelled for years on packed transport ships and finally walks through the Eternity Gate, is supposed to feel, in their bones, that the Imperium is eternal and that its enemies are meaningless. That is the function of all that scale and all that grandeur. But as you go deeper, the architecture changes. The grandeur does not disappear exactly, but it takes on a different quality. It becomes heavier, older, more oppressive. The corridors that lead into the inner palace are lined with the battle standards of thousands of Space Marine chapters and Imperial Guard regiments, relics of campaigns that most people living today have never heard of. The air in those corridors is thick with incense and the distant, barely audible hum of machinery that has been running continuously for longer than any living person can remember. And then there are the doors. The Imperial Palace has a great many doors. There are the ceremonial ones, enormous bronze constructions covered in relief carvings depicting the Emperor's triumph over the arch-traitor Horus, meant to be opened on high feast days and processional occasions. There are the practical ones, ferrocrete and adamantium slabs that slide aside for maintenance crews and administrative personnel. And then there are the other kind, the ones that are not meant to be opened at all. You can recognize them by a few distinguishing characteristics. They tend to be set deeper into the wall than normal doors, as though the structure itself is trying to push them back, to keep them from the corridor. But the seals on them are not purely mechanical. Anyone with even a trace of psychic sensitivity will feel something wrong in the air near them, a kind of pressure, like the atmospheric shift before a particularly violent storm, except that this storm has been building for centuries and is not planning to break anytime soon. The custodians who guard them do not look at the doors while they stand watch. This is apparently a survival strategy. Looking directly at some of these seals for extended periods causes psychological damage in even the most hardened transhuman warriors. There are several named locations within the Imperial Palace complex that deserve individual examination, because each one represents a different kind of sealed secret and a different answer to the question of why nobody opens them. The Forbidden Vault is perhaps the most intriguingly named, which is saying something in an environment where everything has a dramatic title. Located deep beneath the Golden Throne itself, the Forbidden Vault has adamantium gates locked by stasis fields. An entry requires the seal of the High Lords of Terra themselves, meaning that literally, only the most powerful governing council in the entire human Imperium can authorize someone to enter. The records that describe it, to the extent that any external records exist, say that it contains secret knowledge collected by humanity since the dawn of time. Not since the founding of the Imperium. Not since the Horus Heresy. Since the dawn of time. The knowledge stored in it, according to sources that speak of it in the same hushed tones one uses for things that could genuinely kill you, can drive an individual insane. One of the few specific details that has escaped into the broader record is that it contains a visual record of a Necron attack. For anyone unfamiliar with Necrons, consider that they are an ancient race of immortal machine beings who have been dormant for approximately 60 million years and are now waking up. The fact that humanity had encounters with them ancient enough to be stored in a vault that predates the Imperium, and that this information is considered so dangerous that even accessing it is tightly restricted, raises a question that the lore has never fully answered. What did that visual record show? What did humanity learn about the Necrons in that encounter that was considered too dangerous for anyone to know? The Library Sanctus is a different kind of sealed archive. Less a vault containing dangerous objects and more a library containing dangerous knowledge. It holds information on some of the oldest and most sinister events and artifacts in galactic history. The lore specifically mentions that it contains records on the Men of Iron, which were the sentient artificial intelligences of the Dark Age of technology, whose uprising nearly destroyed humanity the first time, and detailed information about the Imga monolith, a mysterious Necron structure that the broader Imperium is only beginning to understand the purpose of in the current era. It also houses the only known, complete and continuously updated copy of the Tactica Imperium, the military doctrine of the Imperium in its most comprehensive form, and certain other records about Space Marine chapter origins and dark events of history that are not supposed to exist outside of this archive. The Library Sanctus is fascinating because it represents a different approach to dangerous knowledge. Instead of destroying information that could be catastrophic, the Imperium chose to contain it. This reflects something genuinely complicated about Imperial philosophy. The Administratum, the organization responsible for much of the Imperium's bureaucratic governance, is deeply ambivalent about knowledge. On one hand, the Imperium runs on information. You cannot administrate a galaxy-spanning empire without knowing things. On the other hand, the Imperium has a very strong cultural and religious instinct toward control of information, has toward keeping dangerous truths out of the hands of people who might misuse them. The Library Sanctus is the tension between those two impulses made architectural. The information exists, it must exist, but it exists here, behind doors that require extraordinary authorization to open, in an archive that most of the people who nominally govern the Imperium do not even know is there. And then there is the Vault of Origins, which is connected to the ecclesiarchy in ways that make certain senior cardinals deeply uncomfortable if you ask them about it. Miles upon miles of corridors lined with ancient stasis generators that preserve documents and objects that would otherwise crumble to dust. The secrecy around it is so extreme that several ecclesiarchs, the effectively supreme religious leaders of the entire Imperium, were never told it existed, and others who discovered its existence were denied entry. The Vault of Origins apparently contains the original handwritten texts of the Imperial Creed, the foundational documents of the state religion of the Imperium, and first-hand accounts of the Horus heresy that are so different from the official narrative that making them public would require the ecclesiarchy to substantially rewrite its entire theological framework. There are whispers of an ancient order of sentinels who control access to it, an order whose own origins are lost to time, a secret kept by secret keepers who have themselves become a secret. Think about that for a moment. A vault containing the true history of the founding of the Imperium's religion, guarded by an organization that nobody knows about, but that even the head of that religion is not always permitted to enter. The question of why nobody opens it answers itself the moment you look at it clearly. The ecclesiarchy depends on a particular version of history. The imperial creed depends on the emperor being understood in a specific way. If the actual, original, unfiltered records of the Horus heresy were made public, if people could read first-hand accounts of what actually happened, rather than the religious mythology that has grown up around those events over 10,000 years, the implications for the stability of the Imperium's most important social institution would be incalculable. Some secrets are kept not because the knowledge itself is dangerous, but because the truth is more complicated than the story that has grown up to replace it. Add to Part 3, the Dark Cells. What sleeps below? There is a place beneath the Imperial Palace that the Adeptus Custodes call the Dark Cells. Other names exist for it across different periods of the Imperium's history. The Vaults of Rhython is one older name, used before the Horus heresy, when the Legio Custodes, as they were then known, used it for the same purpose. The Black Cells is another, a name that seems to have arisen organically among those few people who know about it, inspired by the oppressive quality of the darkness there, which is described as feeling somehow heavier than ordinary darkness, as though the light itself has decided not to enter these corridors. The Dark Cells are not just a vault of knowledge or forbidden objects, they are a prison. More specifically, they are the prison where the Imperium keeps things it cannot kill. That distinction is worth sitting with. The Imperium of Man, a civilization that has been fighting wars on a galaxy-spanning scale for 10,000 years, an empire that counts among its defenders beings who can survive almost anything, and weapons capable of destroying entire worlds, has a special place for the things that cannot be destroyed. Things that have been fought, beaten in some operational sense, contained, and then brought here because every other option ran out. Things so dangerous that simply transporting them to this location required the personal involvement of some of the most powerful warriors the Imperium possesses. Things that, once sealed behind the psychic wards and runic locks and sanctic circles of the Dark Cells, must be watched by a full shield host of Adeptus Custodes, over 100 black-armored warriors patrolling continuously, not in rotating shifts where some of them sleep while others watch, continuously. The official description in available sources is carefully vague, in the way that official descriptions of genuinely terrifying things tend to be. The Dark Cells contain, quote, entities and artifacts that date back to the Age of Strife, that could be used to annihilate the Imperium of Man itself if they were to break free, or be used by those with nefarious purposes. The vaults contain objects and beings from the era called the Old Night, horrors from the depths of humanity's darkest historical period. But there are details that slip through even the most careful bureaucratic language. The sources note that not all of the prisoners are truly alive, but all have anima, which is one of those statements that raises more questions than it answers. What does it mean to have anima without being alive? In the cosmology of Warhammer 40,000, anima refers to something like spiritual essence or soul stuff, the kind of force that allows entities to interact with the warp. Things in the Dark Cells that are not alive, but still have this quality. Things that exist somewhere in the space between living and unliving, between the material world and the immaterial one. The atmosphere of the corridors around the Dark Cells is described in ways that should be taken seriously. The custodians who guard it, the Shadow Keepers, are among the most psychologically resilient beings in the Imperium. They are transhuman warriors who have been specifically selected and conditioned for this particular duty. Beings who have looked upon horrors that would shatter an ordinary person's mind entirely and kept functioning. And even they are always on edge in those corridors. The source texts describe the sense of unspeakable threat as never waning, even for beings of the Custodes' extraordinary caliber. There is something in the air there, some emanation from the sealed cells, that registers at a primal level as wrong, as danger, as the kind of fear that lives in the oldest parts of the brain that were never meant to be this far from the open sky. One small specific detail that has leaked out about the contents of the dark cells is particularly haunting. One of the cells contains something called the Soul Delver, identified in records as a demon of Cinch. The Shadow Keepers apparently use it in a specific way. When they need to test candidates for membership in their shield host, they bring the candidate before the Soul Delver and require them to stare into its 9 eyes for a full day and night without blinking. This is not described as a philosophical exercise or a symbolic ritual. It is described as a genuine test of psychological resilience, because whatever the Soul Delver does to the people who look into it, whatever it shows or whispers or attempts to excavate from a person's consciousness, is severe enough to serve as a meaningful selection filter for some of the most psychologically hardened warriors in the Imperium. A demon, in a cell, being used as a training tool for its own jailers. It's because the alternative uses for it are so much worse that this is considered the responsible option. There is also a detail that appeared after the formation of the Great Rift, the galaxy-splitting catastrophe caused by the death of Cadia and the unleashing of enormous warp energies at the end of the 41st Millennium. When the rift opened and those vast forces tore through the veil between reality and the warp, the custodians discovered that several cells in the dark cells were empty, not broken open, not melted through, empty as though whatever had been in them had simply ceased to be present in the material universe. Spirited away is how the sources put it, by some unholy force. The things that had been contained there were now out in the galaxy. They were the Shadow Keepers' problem now. They became the reason why this shield host, which had been focused exclusively on guarding the cells for 10,000 years, began sending warriors out into wider space for the first time, hunting, recovering, trying to put back what had been let out. The fact that this happened, that an event of sufficient magnitude could effectively reach into the most secure prison in the Imperium and extract prisoners that the custodians could not even detect leaving, tells us something deeply unsettling about the nature of the threat these cells are meant to contain. They are not containment for ordinary physical dangers. They are containment for things that exist partially or entirely outside the normal rules of the physical universe. And when sufficiently enormous forces act on the fabric of reality itself, those containment measures can fail in ways that leave no visible evidence. The architecture of the dark cells reflects this. The technology used to keep them sealed includes not just runic locks, which are physical devices encoded with psychic-resistant runes, but psychic wards and sanctic circles, which are forms of spiritual defense against entities that can move through or affect the psychic realm. The combination is necessary because the things being contained are not purely material. They have to be held in both realms simultaneously. The wards have to prevent the prisoners from reaching out through the warp to influence the material world, while the physical locks prevent anything that might be in a more material state from simply walking out. It is a dual-layer containment system for things that exist on both sides of the boundary between reality and unreality at the same time. And crucially, this entire system exists at the bottom of the most heavily guarded complex, on the most militarily defended planet, in the Imperium of Man. The dark cells are not simply a dangerous room somewhere. They are the most secure location within the most secure location within the most secure location available to humanity. The fact that they require this level of security tells you something important about what they contain. These are not things that the Imperium could not figure out how to handle. These are things the Imperium figured out how to handle, and this, with all the transhuman warriors and psychic wards, and 10,000 years of accumulated defensive expertise is the handling. You do not open the dark cells because the Shadow Keepers are not there to let you in, and they are not there to let you in because they understand, in a way that a brief reading of the available sources makes viscerally clear, that whatever is on the other side of those doors should never, under any circumstances, be on the same side as anything else. Something else about the dark cells deserves to be said slowly, because it is easy to read past it without absorbing its full weight. The complex that houses them spans 81 levels, 81 distinct floors, each one a full level of infrastructure dedicated entirely to the containment of things that cannot be contained anywhere else. There is a service entrance to this complex, known as the Door of Cogs, a maintenance access point used by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who perform upkeep on the arcane technology of the containment system. That door connects to the Mechanicum Ambassador Enclave within the Imperial Palace, and the tech priests who use it are subjected to weeks-long purging and quarantine protocols after each visit. The most sensitive maintenance personnel are executed afterward, because the margin of acceptable information leakage from those corridors is essentially zero. 81 levels. That is not a room or a wing or a facility. It is an entire underground complex of considerable scale, dedicated to a purpose that most citizens of the Imperium do not know exists. And it is maintained not by some automated system or a small team of specialists, but by over 100 of the most elite warriors humanity can produce, patrolling continuously, their weapons specifically designed for use as a last resort against the things they guard. Ancient weapons of mysterious provenance, the sources say. Weapons whose purpose is unclear, even to the Shadow Keepers themselves in some cases, carried because they were put in Shadow Keeper hands by predecessors who understood what they might eventually need to be used against. The image that emerges from all of this is not the image of a vault. It is the image of a battlefield in permanent stalemate. The Shadow Keepers and their charges exist in a relationship that has been ongoing for 10,000 years, a continuous standoff in which the guards maintain their vigilance and the prisoners test their containment, and neither side ever fully wins because a win for either would represent a catastrophe for everyone else. Part 4. The Shadow Keepers, Wardens of the Unthinkable. To understand the dark cells fully, you have to understand the people who guard them. Because the Shadow Keepers are one of the most fascinating and underexplored organizations in all of Warhammer 40,000. They are a shield host of the Adeptus Custodes, which means they are drawn from the same pool of transhuman warriors who guard the Emperor's physical form, beings who make Space Marines look understated in terms of raw physical capability. But the Shadow Keepers are different from their fellows in ways that go beyond their black armor and their somber demeanor. The Adeptus Custodes are organized into shield hosts, which function loosely as the equivalent of companies or battalions within a conventional army. Each shield host has a particular focus, a specific duty or area of expertise. Some are dedicated to scouting and intelligence. Some are the heavy assault formations that lead the most dangerous operations, and some are the personal bodyguards of specific high-ranking officials. The Shadow Keepers are the shield host dedicated to the Dark Cells, and they have been doing exactly this duty since before the Horus Heresy. The organization that became the Shadow Keepers was operating the Vaults of Rythan, their pre-heresy predecessor, during the Great Crusade. That is at least 10,000 years of continuous dedicated service to a single, specific, deeply terrible purpose. This has shaped them in ways that are visible even through the deliberately restrained language of the source texts. The Shadow Keepers are described as the sternest of all guardians, and the qualities that make someone suitable for this role are specific: utter fearlessness, steely vigilance, and a psychological constitution that allows them to stand in corridors that unsettle even fellow custodians for decades at a time without the accumulated pressure breaking them. Some Shadowkeepers have stood their watch for literal decades without rotating out, because the nature of the threat they guard against requires continuity of presence, and because the selection process for new members is sufficiently brutal that there are never as many Shadowkeepers as might ideally be preferred. Their leader carries the title of Lockwarden, a name that is borne in perpetuity regardless of who currently holds the position. The Lockwarden must be personally involved in any operation to either capture and imprison a new threat in the dark cells, or to recover something that has escaped. But this makes the Lockwarden one of the most uniquely qualified beings in the Imperium, the person who has the most operational experience with the kinds of things that are too dangerous for conventional containment, too persistent for destruction, and too hazardous for anyone else to approach. The current Lockwarden, as of the late 41st Millennium, is a custodian named Borsa Thirsk, who had held the position for a century and a half before the Great Rift opened. The sources describe him as a grim and frighteningly intense warrior, which in the context of the Adeptus Custodes means something. Custodians are not, as a rule, cheerful or relaxed individuals. They are beings who have been engineered to near perfection, who carry the weight of 10,000 years of vigil and an endless, grinding responsibility. Thirsk, within that context, he stands out as particularly severe. He left Terra only twice before the formation of the Great Rift. Since then, he has barely set foot on Terra at all, because the things that escaped when the rift tore open required the Lockwarden's personal attention. The induction process for the Shadowkeepers is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates the kind of psychological standards this duty requires. The Soul Delver trial mentioned earlier is not a unique eccentricity. It is representative of an induction philosophy built around demonstrating that the candidate can withstand direct exposure to the kinds of entities they will be guarding. You cannot be a jailer of things that damage the mind by simply looking at them if your own mind is susceptible to that damage. The Shadowkeepers, therefore, are specifically selected for their resistance to precisely the kinds of psychic and psychological assault that their prisoners are capable of inflicting. This means that they are, in a meaningful sense, the people who have the best understanding of what is in the dark cells, not in the way of knowing the histories and origins of the entities imprisoned there necessarily, but in the direct, experiential sense of having been exposed to them and having survived, and crucially, surviving the Soul Delver trial or any of the other selection tests the Shadowkeepers use does not mean walking away unaffected. It means walking away functional. There is a subtle but important difference. The sources suggest that all Shadowkeepers carry some kind of permanent mark from this process, some trace of what they have been exposed to, is sealed up inside them the way a scar seals over a wound. They walk around with it every day. They stand in those corridors with it every day. This is perhaps why they are described as a particularly grim, even by custodian standards. They know, in the most direct possible way, what they are keeping the rest of humanity safe from. There is one event in the Shadowkeepers' history that is worth examining carefully, because it reveals something about the calculus involved in never opening those cells. During the battle for the Lionsgate spaceport, one of the critical engagements of the siege of the Imperial Palace during the Horus Heresy in the 41st Millennium's equivalent event, called the Battle of Lion's Gate in the Era Indomitus, Lockwarden Thirsk made an extraordinary decision, when he gave the order for a large portion of his shield host to join the battle, leaving only a handful of Shadowkeepers behind to guard the dark cells. Think about what that decision represents. The Lockwarden, the person who more than anyone else understands the threat level of the cells, looked at the situation on the surface and decided that the immediate military threat was serious enough to justify reducing the guard on the most dangerous prison on Terra to a skeleton crew. This was not made lightly. The number of Shadowkeepers required to maintain safe guard on the cells is not an arbitrary number. It is the minimum required to maintain the wards, respond to any sign of activity inside the cells, and prevent any external attempt to breach them from succeeding. Reducing that number to a handful was a calculated risk. As an acknowledgement that the battle above was sufficiently catastrophic that even the catastrophic risk of understaffing the dark cells was the better option. Thirsk's gamble held.
Okay, real talk for a second, and this is just me genuinely stepping outside the lore for a second. What I personally love about this topic, the thing that keeps pulling me back to it, is that the sealed vaults are not really a lore mystery in the traditional sense. It's not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It's more like the Imperium holding up a mirror and asking, how much truth do you actually want? Because every layer you peel back on Terra, every sealed door you look a little too closely, the answer that comes back is the same one. It was always the same one. Some things are locked away, not because we forgot about them, but because we decided, very deliberately, that knowing was worse than not knowing. And honestly, as someone who has spent way too many hours going down these rabbit holes, I find that genuinely haunting. Not in a horror movie kind of way, but in the quiet way. The way you feel when you realize a story you thought was about monsters is actually about the choices people make. But anyways, that's just my read on it. Let's go back to the video.
Nothing escaped while most of his warriors were fighting on the surface. But the fact that he had to make that gamble, and that it was genuinely a gamble rather than a certainty, tells you something about the margin of safety that the Shadow Keepers operate with. They are, always, one sustained crisis away from being spread too thin. The dark cells are not a set-it-and-forget-it containment system. They require constant, active, expert attention from specialized warriors who are themselves irreplaceable. The cells are only sealed as long as the people who know how to seal them remain present and functional. But there is also a curious secondary use that the Shadow Keepers have made of their charges. In one documented case during the Indomitus Crusade, the Shadow Keepers opened one of the dark cells and provided the technology inside to the Imperial Fist's Space Marine chapter. This technology was used to restore the Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's enormous star fortress, after it was damaged during the Plague Wars. The fact that this was possible, that a cell containing something that had been locked away for decades or centuries could be opened carefully, the contents extracted and used for a specific purpose, and then resealed, is important. It means the Shadow Keepers are not simply sealing things and walking away. They maintain operational knowledge of what each cell contains and a technical capacity to interact with specific items in specific ways under specific conditions. But note the implication. If they could open one cell for a specific purpose, they could open any cell for a specific purpose. The reason they do not is not primarily mechanical. It is a matter of judgment. The Lock Warden and the Shadow Keepers are the gatekeepers, not just physically, but philosophically. The arbiters of when a sealed thing's existence in the wider world is justified by the benefit, and their default position, maintained over 10 millennia of continuous operation, is that almost nothing justifies it. The threshold for opening a dark cell is extraordinarily high, high enough that it has happened effectively never. And the one time it did happen was in the context of restoring one of the most important military assets the Imperium possesses. You do not open the dark cells because the people who guard them have spent 10,000 years developing the judgment to know when they should remain closed. And that judgment says, almost always. Part 5. The Golden Throne and the Wound Beneath It. Of all the sealed things on Terra, none is more central to everything the Imperium of Man is, or more closely connected to the specific questions we are exploring than the Golden Throne. And the Golden Throne is interesting precisely because it is not simply a throne. It was never meant to be simply a throne. It was designed as a door. Understanding this requires going back to one of the most intriguing secrets in Warhammer 40,000 lore, at the Emperor's Imperial Webway project, known to those very few individuals who knew of its existence before the Horus Heresy as the Great Work. In the period just before the heresy, when the Emperor left the Great Crusade and returned to Terra, ostensibly to govern the Imperium he had built, he was actually doing something else entirely, something he told no one about, not his Primarch sons, not his custodian guard, not even Malcador the Sigillite, his closest companion and wisest counselor, at least not fully. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in a complex of workshops and laboratories that spanned the depths of Terra's bedrock, the Emperor was building a door into the webway. The webway is the interdimensional travel network originally constructed by the Aeldari, the ancient civilization of space elves whose fall created the chaos god Slanesh, and effectively ended their dominance of the galaxy. It exists in a space between the material universe and the warp, neither fully one nor the other, a series of tunnels and passages that allow faster-than-light travel without the hazards of conventional warp travel. Using the webway, you do not need psychers to navigate. You do not need navigators to guide you through the madness of the Imperium. You simply enter a tunnel and emerge somewhere else, quickly and safely. And the ruinous powers of chaos do not have an opportunity to interfere with your journey because the webway is, or at least was designed to be, shielded from the warp by its own psychic architecture. The Emperor's vision was to give this to humanity, all of it, a human webway, as connected to the Aeldari network through a portal beneath Terra, expanding outward through new tunnels constructed by a specially created caste of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests called the Unifiers. If this had worked, the Imperium of Man would have had access to instant, safe, warp-free travel between all its worlds. The Astronomicon would have been unnecessary. Warp ships would have been unnecessary. The sacrifice of psychers, the constant horrifying toll of souls fed to the Golden Throne, would have been unnecessary. The Emperor could have severed humanity's connection to the warp entirely, starving chaos of the human fear and suffering and psychic energy that feeds it, and guided the species toward a future in which it was genuinely, fundamentally safe from the ruinous powers in a way it had never been before. This is what the Emperor was doing while his Primarchs fought his wars and resented his absence. He was trying to save everyone. The project was discovered by the Golden Throne itself, which at that point was not a life support mechanism, but a psychic amplifier and portal key, the mechanism through which the Emperor maintained and expanded the human sections of the webway from his position on Terra. Tens of thousands of Mechanicum workers labored in the tunnels below, constructing new passages under the psychic protection the Emperor provided. Thousands of custodians fought running battles against Aeldari, who were not pleased to have humans setting up in their interdimensional transit network. The whole thing was a war within the walls of reality itself, invisible to everyone not directly involved. And then Magnus the Red, the 1,000 Suns Primarch, and the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, made what was arguably the worst individual mistake in the history of the Imperium. In an effort to warn the Emperor about Horus's treachery, he used a psychic ritual that he knew was forbidden, sending an astral projection directly through the Emperor's wards. The shockwave from this sending tore through every psychic shield the Emperor had constructed around the Imperial Palace and the Webway project. The carefully maintained psychic sheathing that protected the human-built tunnels from warp incursion shattered. Cracks appeared in the walls between the webway and the warp, and through those cracks poured everything that had been pressing against them, waiting. Demons, thousands of them, then tens of thousands. The Mechanicum workers died in moments, and slaughtered in the tunnels they had spent years constructing. The custodians, who numbered in the tens of thousands at this time, fought a desperate rearguard action through the webway, while the Emperor remained on the Golden Throne, desperately trying to hold the shattered shields together through raw psychic force alone. A battle was fought in the webway that nobody in the wider Imperium knew about, a grinding, years-long struggle to prevent the demonic tide from reaching the Imperial Palace portal and spilling out into the material universe, flooding Terra itself with everything the warp had been holding back. The custodians were reduced to less than 10% of their previous number by this war. The Sisters of Silence who fought alongside them suffered equally devastating losses. And the battle ended, not in victory, but in an enforced stalemate, the Emperor sealing the webway portal and retreating from the tunnels just as Horus began his open rebellion. The great work was over. All those centuries of labor, all those workers' deaths, All those custodian sacrifices in battles nobody would ever record, burned away in a moment by one well-intentioned but catastrophically executed warning. And the door that the Emperor had built as a way to connect all of humanity remained, but now it could not be opened. It could only be kept closed, because on the other side of it, pressing against the seal with 10,000 years of accumulated pressure, is everything that poured in when Magnus shattered the wards. The webway beneath Terra is compromised. It is and has been for 10,000 years. Full of exactly the things it was designed to keep out. This is why the Emperor is on the Golden Throne. Not primarily because he is injured, though he is. Not because the Imperium lacks a capable successor, though finding one is nearly impossible. He is on the Golden Throne because the psychic seal between Terra and the webway is held in place by his power. And if he stops providing that power, the seal fails, and the door opens, and what comes through the door destroys everything. Every second the Emperor remains on the throne is a second that Terra is not overrun by a demonic incursion that would dwarf anything the Imperium has ever faced. Every hour is another hour of delay before an event that would be functionally indistinguishable from the end of humanity. The Golden Throne is not just a throne, it is, in a very literal sense, at the most important sealed vault on Terra. Part 6. The failing throne and the cost of keeping it running. There is a layer of this problem that becomes fully apparent only when you look at what the Golden Throne is doing over time. It is not simply sustaining a static, stable situation. It is fighting a slow, losing battle, and the cost of fighting that battle has been escalating for 10,000 years. The most obvious cost is the human lives. The throne requires the sacrifice of approximately 1,000 psykers every single day to maintain its functions. These are not metaphorical sacrifices. These are people. Human beings brought to Terra aboard the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Humans who were born with the psychic mutation that allows interaction with the warp. Who were collected from their home worlds as part of the Imperial tithe, transported to Terra, and consumed by the mechanisms of the Golden Throne to provide the energy it needs. 1,000 people every day. 365,000 per year. 3.5 billion over the 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence. Staggering numbers. Numbers that put into perspective how many people have died. Not in wars, or from disease, or from any of the countless other ways the 41st Millennium kills people, but specifically because the Emperor needed to be kept running, and the rate is going up. By the late 36th Millennium, around 5,000 years into the Imperium's existence, the Golden Throne began to require more and more psyker energy to maintain optimal function. Something in its ancient mechanisms was degrading, shifting, losing efficiency. By the early 41st Millennium, it required 4 times the psyker sacrifice to maintain the same power levels. By the very end of the 41st Millennium, the last year of that era, Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, who had devoted their entire lives to maintaining the throne, made a discovery that was so alarming it was immediately classified at the highest possible level. Many mechanisms of the Golden Throne had developed failures beyond the current ability of the Adeptus Mechanicus to repair. This is worth saying again. The most important machine in the Imperium, the one that keeps the Emperor alive and the webway portal sealed and the Astronomicon operating and the entire structure of human civilization in the galaxy from collapsing, is failing. And the best engineers humanity has produced cannot fix it. They can patch it, add new layers of machinery over the deteriorating old ones, strip out redundant sections and try to route around the failing parts. But they cannot actually repair it. They cannot reverse the decay. They are, at best, slowing it down. The knowledge of this is suppressed. Of course it is. The idea of the Golden Throne failing is not just psychologically catastrophic for a population that has literally deified the Emperor. It is practically catastrophic in ways that transcend the religious dimension. If the warp portal beneath Terra loses its seal, if the psychic barrier the Emperor has been maintaining for 10,000 years fails, the resulting demonic incursion would not simply destroy Terra. It would create a permanent rift into the warp at the heart of the Imperium's power, as something analogous to the Eye of Terra, but located at the center of human civilization rather than its periphery. the Astronomicon would go dark. Warp travel would become impossible across huge swaths of the galaxy as the beacon died. The Imperium, already under existential pressure from chaos, from the Tyranids pressing in from the galactic east, from a galaxy-wide Necron awakening, from the endless grinding attrition of 10,000 different threats, would lose the one navigational and psychic anchor that holds it together. What the Mechanicum's desperate response to this discovery reveals about the nature of the problem is particularly interesting. Faced with a machine they could not repair, facing a disaster they could not prevent through any normal means, as a cabal of high-ranking members of the Imperium did something that in any other context would have been considered absolutely unthinkable. They went to the Dark Elder for help. This is not a metaphor. In the events immediately preceding the formation of the Great Rift, a secret conspiracy involving 3 members of the High Lords of Terra, an Inquisitor Lord, and senior members of the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to smuggle a Dark Eldar homunculus, one of the sadistic master flesh sculptors of Komorrach, onto Terra. The plan was to have this homunculus examine the Golden Throne, apply the extraordinary technical knowledge that the Dark Eldar possess about the intersection of technology and living biology, and provide a solution to the throne's deterioration that the Mechanicum itself was incapable of developing. It did not go well. The homunculus went rogue inside the Imperial Palace, conducting experiments on the humans it encountered in the depths below the palace, pursuing its own agenda rather than fulfilling the bargain it had ostensibly agreed to. When the custodians discovered what was happening, the conspiracy unraveled. Several High Lords were implicated. The whole thing was, by any conventional assessment, a catastrophe of political and security ramifications that would occupy the Inquisition and the Adeptus Custodes for years. But here is the thing. The custodians, when they discovered the conspiracy, did not simply shut it down. According to the records that emerged from the Vaults of Terra novel series, which explores these events through fiction that is broadly considered law-consistent, the custodians ultimately allowed certain aspects of the exchange to proceed because the throne failing was a direct threat to their primary mission, and in the absence of any better option, even a deeply compromised and dangerous arrangement with Xenos was preferable to the alternative. This is what desperation looks like at the highest levels of the Imperium. This is what it means that the Golden Throne is failing. The people who know about it, who understand what failure means, are willing to make bargains that 10,000 years of Imperial doctrine say they should never make, because the door they are trying to keep sealed is worth more than any amount of political consistency or religious purity. And the experts who examined those repairs, who looked at what the Dark Elder technical solutions actually achieved, concluded that even the best-case scenario, even if everything the homunculus provided was genuine and effective, only bought a few additional centuries before the same failure modes reasserted themselves. A few centuries, in a civilization that measures its history in millennia. The vault, in this context, is failing. The lock is deteriorating, and nobody, not the best engineers in the Imperium, not the Xenos artificers they have reluctantly consulted, has a real solution. The image that emerges from all of this is worth sitting with for a moment. The Golden Throne, the object that most citizens of the Imperium understand, through the lens of their religion, as the seat of their divine protector, the place where the Emperor of mankind sits in eternal vigilance and shields his chosen people from the darkness, and is in fact a deteriorating machine that requires the death of roughly 1,000 human beings every single day to remain operational, is failing in ways that its tenders cannot repair, and is at constant risk of catastrophic failure that would result in a dimensional breach at the heart of the Imperium's capital world. The religion built around it, the most widely practiced belief system in the galaxy, has been carefully constructed to make people feel protected and guided by the Emperor's presence. And the Emperor is, objectively, present. His psychic influence is real. The Astronomicon is real. The seal on the webway is real. All of these things are genuinely happening. But the gap between the religious narrative and the mechanical reality of what is happening in the Sanctum Imperialis is vast. The throne room itself, of 4 miles long and half a mile high, is described as a place where most ordinary humans would die within seconds from the combination of intense psychic radiation, mechanical emissions, and the sheer overwhelming presence of the Emperor's concentrated will. The rotting form of what was once humanity's greatest defender, wired into a machine of unfathomable complexity that nobody fully understands anymore, surrounded by mountains of apparatus and shrouded in alchemical fog, is not the serene and glorious image that is painted on the walls of every cathedral in the Imperium. It is something much more painful and much more honest about the price that has been paid to hold the darkness back. This is another reason nobody opens the vaults. The truth is not just dangerous in the way of releasing physically hazardous entities. The truth is dangerous in the way of destroying the myth that a civilization needs to keep functioning. Knowing what is really in those rooms, knowing what the Golden Throne really is, and what it is really doing, and how close it is to failure, is the kind of knowledge that cannot be unlearned and that changes everything it touches. The people who know it carry it differently. They look at the Imperial Creed with different eyes. They hear the prayers of the faithful with a different quality of attention, and they understand, in ways that those faithful cannot, what the cost of those prayers actually is. The senior custodians and the inner circle of the Mechanicum and the handful of high lords with sufficient clearance carry this weight every day. It shapes them into the specific kind of grimness that senior imperial officials project. Was not theatrical grimness, not performed austerity, but the genuine, bone-deep exhaustion of people who know how bad things actually are and have decided to keep showing up anyway, because the alternative is not showing up. And not showing up means the darkness wins. There is something quietly heroic about that, in the specific and unusual register that 40K offers heroism. It is not the heroism of battle, not the heroism of sacrifice or glory or the charge into impossible odds. It is the heroism of maintenance, of continued presence, of doing the necessary and exhausting and unglamorous work of keeping the doors closed when every instinct says they are about to fall open anyway. Part 7. The Age of Strife. What was locked away, and why, to understand the contents of the dark cells and the deep vaults in their full context. You need to go back much further in time, to the era that created most of the contents in the first place. The Age of Strife, also called the Old Night, is the historical period the Imperium comes after, the darkness that the Emperor was trying to end when he emerged from obscurity during the Unification Wars. Understanding it is essential to understanding why the things sealed in those cells cannot be destroyed, cannot be safely studied, and cannot be allowed to escape. The Age of Strife lasted for approximately 5,000 years, from roughly the 25th millennium to the 30th. Before it, there had been the Dark Age of technology, which is exactly what it sounds like. A period of human scientific and technological achievement so extraordinary that humanity built a civilization spanning the galaxy, had created artificial intelligences capable of independent thought and self-improvement, colonized thousands of worlds, and in some cases achieved things that the best minds of the current Imperium can barely describe in theoretical terms, let alone replicate. It was, by all surviving accounts, a genuine golden age for the human species. It ended because of the Eldar. Not directly. The Eldar did not invade or attack or deliberately harm humanity during this period. What they did was create Slaanesh. For millions of years, the ancient Eldar civilization had been growing increasingly decadent, increasingly hedonistic, increasingly focused on sensation and experience in ways that slowly, imperceptibly, began to manifest in the warp as a vast accumulation of psychic energy. The warp reflects the emotions and thoughts and desires of living beings, but the collective psychic output of a galaxy-spanning civilization of extraordinarily psychic beings, channeled into increasingly extreme experiences over millions of years, was not going to go unnoticed by the immaterial realm. It coalesced, it grew, and one day, in the 29th millennium, it reached a critical mass, and a new chaos god was born. tearing a wound in the fabric of the galaxy that would eventually be known as the Eye of Terra. This birthing event sent shockwaves through the warp that affected every world in the galaxy simultaneously. Warp storms erupted everywhere. The currents of the Imperium, already turbulent, became essentially impassable. Worlds lost contact with each other. The Psychers, who had become relatively common across human-settled space by this point, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by warp energies they had no training to handle and no framework to understand. Demonic possession became endemic. Worlds fell to chaos, not through organized military invasion, but through simple psychic collapse, through the flood of warp entities that poured through Psychers who had no defenses against them. Humanity was hit particularly hard because it was, by this point, extraordinarily dependent on interstellar infrastructure. When the warp storms cut off the shipping lanes, worlds that imported most of their food and manufactured goods suddenly found themselves isolated. Famine followed, social breakdown followed, war followed, and through the cracks opened by famine and war and social breakdown, the warp found its way in. And things came through that should never have been able to reach the material universe. On Terra itself, the situation was catastrophic. The planet that was, even then, the nominal homeworld of humanity and the seat of whatever passed for interstellar governance, descended into the kind of primordial chaos that it had not experienced since long before any recorded history. Techno-barbarian warlords carved it into a patchwork of city-states and tribal territories. Ancient weapons, things from the dark age of technology that had been designed for industrial-scale destruction, were deployed in conflicts between neighbors. The atmosphere was damaged. The environment was poisoned. The population, once measured in the tens of billions on a world that had been importing food from across the galaxy, crashed catastrophically. And in the chaos of those thousands of years, things happened on Terra that have never been fully recorded. Things from the warp walked on its surface during particularly severe incursions. Experiments were conducted by desperate people with access to dangerous technology and no remaining ethical framework to constrain them. Weapons were built, not just conventional weapons, but weapons that operated on psychic or spiritual or biological principles that the Imperium of today would classify as heretical without a second thought. Some of those weapons were used. Some of them had effects that outlasted their users by thousands of years. When the Emperor emerged during the Unification Wars and began the process of reclaiming Terra, he was working through a landscape that was simultaneously a war zone and an archaeological site of horrors. The things that needed to be dealt with were not only the human warlords who opposed him militarily, there were also the other things, the remnants of the age of strife that could not simply be fought with guns, the entities and artifacts, and constructs that were too dangerous to be allowed to remain at large on a planet that was going to be the capital of a new human empire. Some of these were destroyed. The Emperor's capabilities are not fully documented in any source available to ordinary scholars, but it is clear that he possessed the psychic power to simply end some of the threats he encountered. Others could not be destroyed, could not be eliminated through any means available, and so they were contained instead. The Vaults of Rythan, precursor to the Dark Cells, was established during this period for exactly this purpose. And the things that resisted the Emperor's direct intervention, things that existed in some fashion outside the normal parameters of destructibility, were sealed instead. The psychic wards and runic locks used to seal them were designed by the Emperor himself, in his pre-heresy period of full power and active engagement with the world. This is why they have lasted 10,000 years. The Emperor, at the height of his power, was building containment for things he knew he could not destroy, and he built it to last. The question of whether it will continue to last, particularly with the opening of the Great Rift and the escalating instability of the broader psychic environment of the galaxy, is one that the Shadowkeepers think about very seriously. Whilst the Age of Strife also produced a second category of sealed things that are perhaps even more interesting than the direct remnants of that era. These are the things that humanity learned during the Age of Strife, and then immediately recognized it should not know. When you have 5,000 years of catastrophic upheaval and the complete collapse of any ethical framework governing scientific or psychic research, a great deal of extremely dangerous knowledge gets generated. Information about how to create artificial demonic entities, detailed technical specifications for weapons capable of destroying stars, methods of psychic manipulation that can break entire civilizations' collective will, records of contact with entities so cosmically powerful that even reading the records alters the psychological makeup of the reader. Yes, this knowledge could not be destroyed, not fully, not across the entire human-occupied galaxy, but it could be collected and sealed. The forbidden vault beneath the golden throne contains some of it. The Library Sanctus contains more. The smaller archives scattered through the depths of the Imperial Palace contain more still. The collective project of gathering this knowledge and sealing it away was one of the Emperor's primary concerns during the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade. Not destroying it, because destruction was often impossible or risky, but consolidating it, controlling access to it, making sure that the catastrophe of the Age of Strife could not simply repeat itself because a sufficiently determined or desperate person found a manual for how to do it again. The vault that sits at the bottom of all of this is the Age of Strife itself, the 5,000-year period of darkness whose consequences are still being managed 10 millennia later. Every sealed door in the depths of Terra is, in some sense, an attempt to keep that door closed. Part 8. The Architecture of Suppression. Why the Imperium keeps these secrets. There is a question that runs through all of this that has not been fully addressed yet. Why does the Imperium specifically choose not to know? Not just to keep dangerous things sealed away where they cannot harm anyone, but to actively suppress the knowledge of their existence, to maintain institutional ignorance, to make the not knowing a deliberate and persistent policy rather than simply an absence of information. This is actually a sophisticated choice, and understanding it requires thinking about what information does in the context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. In our world, knowledge is generally considered neutral, a tool that can be used for good or ill, depending on the intentions of the person wielding it. In the 40,000 universe, this is not quite true. The warp makes it complicated. The warp is a psychic dimension that reflects the collective consciousness of living beings in the material universe. Emotions, beliefs, fears, and desires all manifest in the warp in some form. Sufficiently widespread and intense beliefs about specific entities can actually strengthen those entities within the warp, giving them more power and influence in the material world. As this is one of the mechanisms by which the Chaos Gods exist and grow, they are fed by the collective psychic output of living beings who experience emotions aligned with their domains. Horn grows stronger when blood is spilled in anger. Nurgle grows stronger when despair and disease and acceptance of death spread through populations. Tzeentch grows stronger with scheming and manipulation and the constant churning of plans within plans. This means that knowledge of dangerous things, widespread knowledge, is not neutral. If every citizen of the Imperium knew exactly what was sealed in the dark cells, knew the true nature of the entities imprisoned there, knew that these things were powerful enough to defy the Emperor's attempts to destroy them, the resulting collective fear and dread would have real, tangible effects in the warp. What it would feed the entities that the knowledge was about. It would make them more powerful. It would potentially destabilize the very wards that contain them. There is also the more straightforward psychological and social dimension. The Imperium is a civilization under existential pressure. It faces threats from every direction simultaneously. The Tyranids are a galaxy-consuming biological force arriving from outside the Milky Way. The Necrons are awakening from 60 million years of dormancy in numbers that dwarf the entire human population. Chaos is pressing from within the warp, from inside human institutions through corruption and heresy, and from the Eye of Terror through military incursions. Orcs reproduce faster than they can be killed, and their collective psychic field makes them collectively stronger the more of them fight together. Against this background, The Imperium depends on the morale and the faith and the continuing functional engagement of trillions of ordinary human beings who go to work every day, perform their role in the vast machine of imperial society, and keep civilization running. These people are not warriors, they are not psychers. They are farmers and factory workers, and administrators and pilots and priests. Their psychological stability is not a luxury. It is a structural requirement for the society to continue functioning. If those people really knew, the full extent of what the Imperium was facing, not just the abstract version mediated through religious narrative about the Emperor's divine protection, but the concrete reality of what is in the dark cells, and what is wrong with the Golden Throne, and what was done to build the Forbidden Vault, the social consequences would be catastrophic. Not because the information is literally mind-breaking, though some of it is, but because the realistic, rational response to that full picture would be something very close to despair, and a civilization gripped by despair cannot defend itself. The suppression of terrible knowledge in the Imperium is not simply censorship or control for its own sake, though those motivations are certainly present too. It is a calculated psychological defense. The Imperium knows things that would break the minds and spirits of most of its citizens if they were told. It chooses, deliberately and consistently, not to tell them. This is not kindness exactly. The 41st millennium does not have much room for kindness. It is a strategic decision about what the population can bear and what it cannot, about how much truth serves the survival of the species and how much simply immobilizes it. The vaults are sealed, in part, because opening them would mean telling people what is in them, and what is in them cannot be unsaid. There is a deeper philosophical dimension to this as well. The Imperium of man, for all its enormous flaws, its brutal authoritarianism, its institutionalized violence, its religious fanaticism, is trying to preserve something. It is trying to preserve the existence of humanity as a species. Every compromise, every cruelty, every terrible decision made by imperial authorities at every level is made against the background of that overriding purpose. The species must survive. Everything else is negotiable. This is a genuine guiding principle, not just rhetoric, and it shapes imperial decision-making in ways that outsiders to the universe sometimes find difficult to understand. The sealed vaults on Terra are an expression of this principle in its purest form. They contain things that could end humanity. They are sealed not primarily to protect the information or even to protect the institutions that benefit from suppressing it. They are sealed because the alternative, opening them, facing what is in them, attempting to use or study or engage with what is in them, represents a risk to the survival of the species that the Imperium's most senior and most knowledgeable figures have consistently judged to be too high. And here is where the calculation becomes genuinely tragic. The things in those vaults might also contain solutions. Some of what is locked away in the depths of Terra might, if accessed and studied and applied carefully, provide answers to the problems the Imperium is currently facing. The Dark Age of technology achieved things the Imperium cannot replicate. The pre-heresy knowledge of the Emperor and Malcador and the early custodians included capabilities that have been lost. If anyone could get into the Forbidden Vault and actually work through what is in there without losing their sanity, they might find something useful. But the risk calculus has always come back the same way. The probability of gaining a useful solution is smaller than the probability of making things catastrophically worse. The chance of a skilled researcher carefully extracting actionable intelligence from the most dangerous archive on Terra is smaller than the chance of that archive extracting something from them. The vaults are sealed, not because the Imperium is entirely without curiosity or entirely without desperation. They are sealed because every time someone has looked at the problem carefully, the answer has been that the risks outweigh the potential benefits. Until the day they do not. Until the day when the alternative to opening a particular door is something even worse. And that day may be coming. Part 9. The Talisman of 7 Hammers. Terra's final secret. There is one more sealed thing on Terra that deserves its own examination, because it represents the most extreme expression of the entire logic we have been tracing through this exploration. It is not a vault in the conventional sense. It is not a prison or an archive or a restricted library. It is a mechanism built into the Golden Throne itself, installed there during the Horus Heresy by the Primarch Vulcan at the Emperor's explicit direction. It is called the Talisman of Seven Hammers. The Talisman of Seven Hammers is, simply stated, a device capable of destroying all of Terra, not damaging it, not causing severe casualties, destroying it. The Imperial Palace, the Himalaysian range beneath which it was built, the entire throne world, rendered to ash and void. Every person on its surface, every archive, every relic, every artifact, every sealed vault, everything. It was designed as a dead man's switch. If the Emperor died or the Golden Throne failed, and the webway portal tore open, and the demonic tide that had been pressing against the seal for 10,000 years came flooding through, the talisman would activate. A roaring inferno capable of granting even demons true death would consume everything. Terra would be denied to chaos. The ruinous powers, even in victory, even if they somehow managed to destroy the Emperor and seize his throne world, would find nothing there but cinders. Vulcan made it, the Primarch of the Salamanders, the Lord of Drakes. A being of extraordinary craftsmanship who had spent his life on a volcanic world and understood the nature of fire in ways both literal and spiritual, built the most terrible weapon that was ever concealed in the most important place in the Imperium. He built it with his own hands, following his father's instructions, knowing exactly what he was making and why. The sources say he had misgivings. He was Vulcan. He was the Primarch known for his care for ordinary human lives, the one who wept for his warriors and worried about civilian casualties, and maintained his empathy in situations where every other Primarch had long since moved past it. Building a device designed to kill everyone on Terra, including all the humans who served there faithfully, all the pilgrims who had traveled their entire lives to stand for 3 seconds in a cathedral near the place where the Emperor sat, all the ordinary people who had nothing to do with any of this and happened to live on the wrong planet, was not easy for him. He did it anyway, because the alternative was worse. The Talisman of Seven Hammers is the ultimate sealed vault on Terra. It is the vault that contains the ending of Terra itself, held closed as long as the Emperor lives, as long as the Golden Throne holds, as long as the seal on the webway portal remains intact. It is the escape hatch built into the escape hatch. The Imperium's final answer to the question of what to do if everything else fails. Its existence raises a philosophical question that is difficult to sit with, but important to acknowledge. The Emperor and Vulcan, in building this device and installing it in the Golden Throne, made a decision about the ultimate value of Terra. They decided that Terra was worth more as a denial of resources to chaos than as a surviving world. They decided that a universe in which chaos had conquered Terra but found nothing there was preferable to a universe in which chaos had conquered Terra and had something to show for it. A corrupted throne world, a permanent demonic foothold at the heart of what had been human civilization, a dark mirror of the sacred place that an entire civilization had organized itself around. This is brutal. It is also, given the stakes, arguably correct. The Talisman of Seven Hammers represents the Imperium taking seriously its own stated priorities. When the choice is between losing Terra as a living world and losing Terra as a principle, thus the Emperor chose to protect the principle. A destroyed Terra cannot be corrupted. A destroyed Terra cannot become a rallying point for chaos the way a captured Terra could. And the Emperor's rebirth, which multiple strands of lore suggest he has planned for in some form, might be possible from Ash, in a way that it would not be possible from a world corrupted to its core by the ruinous powers. The talisman is also interesting because of what it says about the Emperor's relationship to continuity. He built a device to destroy everything associated with his current existence and his current empire. everything that humanity has built around the idea of him, because he apparently believes something survives that is worth more than all of it. The Golden Throne itself is a kind of vault, sealed to keep a disaster from happening, and held closed by the Emperor's failing body and the sacrificed lives of millions. The talisman is what happens to that vault when it can no longer be held closed. It is the last secret of Terra, and it is sealed as completely as anything in the dark cells. Most of the people who have ever lived on Terra, from the billions of pilgrims to the cardinals and high lords, have no idea it is there. The people who do know exist in a small and closely held circle of the most senior custodians and perhaps a handful of others with sufficiently high clearance. It is a secret that, if widely known, would itself be destabilizing, because the psychological impact of knowing that the place you have made sacred, the world around which an entire religion has been built, carries within it the means of its own deliberate annihilation. While it is not something that can be absorbed by a civilian population already under maximum psychological strain, so it is sealed too, the most extreme seal of all, the vault at the end of all the other vaults. Part 10. Why nobody opens them. The real answer. We have traveled a long way through the dark and the deep. We have looked at the architecture of the Imperial Palace, at the Forbidden Vault, and the Library Sanctus, and the Vault of Origins. We have spent time in the corridors of the dark cells and thought about what it means to guard something too dangerous to destroy. We have explored the history of the Golden Throne and the catastrophe that made it what it is. We have traced the age of strife and the creation of the conditions that filled Terra's depths with sealed horrors. And we have stood, metaphorically, as before the talisman of 7 hammers and contemplated what it means to have built a doomsday device into the most sacred site in the galaxy. Now we can answer the question properly. Why does nobody open the sealed vaults on Terra? The first answer, the most obvious one, is fear. But fear is not simple in this context. It is not the fear of a person who is afraid of the dark or who flinches at loud noises. It is the fear of beings who have seen what happens when these things are disturbed, who have operational knowledge of the consequences of failure in these specific kinds of containment, who understand in the most direct and concrete way available that what is sealed in those cells and behind those wards is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. As the shadow keepers fear the things in the dark cells the way a surgeon fears infection in an open wound, it is specific, informed, technically grounded fear, based on evidence and experience. That kind of fear is not irrational, it is appropriate. The second answer is institutional momentum. The Imperium of Man is an organization that has been operating under the same fundamental directives for 10,000 years. The directive to keep certain things sealed is not written in one document somewhere. It is embedded in the culture, the protocols, the training, the mythology, and the bureaucratic structures of every organization that has anything to do with the deepest levels of terror. The Shadow Keepers do not keep the dark cells sealed because someone told them to this morning. They keep them sealed because keeping them sealed is what the Shadow Keepers are. It is the purpose around which their entire organizational identity has been constructed. The Forbidden Vault requires the seals of the High Lords of Terra to enter not because someone decided that was the right level of bureaucratic authorization, but because 10,000 years of careful institutional design have made sure that opening it requires coordination among people who have strong incentives to keep each other honest about whether opening it is actually necessary. The third answer is lost knowledge. Many of the seals on the deepest vaults were placed by the Emperor personally, or by Malcador, or by the first generations of custodians who operated with detailed knowledge about what they were sealing and why. That knowledge has not been fully transmitted across 10,000 years of institutional history. There are wards on certain doors in the depths of the Imperial Palace whose exact nature and purpose the current Shadow Keepers understand only partially, maintained not because they fully comprehend what they are doing, but because they understand that the alternative to maintaining them is worse than not knowing precisely why they work. The knowledge needed to safely open some of these seals has been lost. Opening them now, without that knowledge, would be comparable to defusing an ancient and poorly documented explosive device by trial and error. The fourth answer is the nature of what is inside. The things in the dark cells are not inert. They are described as having anima, as being in some sense still active even in their containment. They are aware, in ways that vary by individual entity, of their imprisonment. Some of them have spent 10,000 years pressing against their wards, testing the limits of their containment, looking for weaknesses. The Shadow Keepers know this. The records of events, like the growing agitation reported in the cells during the years of madness in the 41st Millennium, the period of strange omens and cult activity before the Great Rift, suggest that the things inside are more active at certain times than others. Opening a cell means opening it when the thing inside has had 10,000 years to prepare for that possibility. The fifth answer is the one that is perhaps most uniquely and specifically tied to the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Information is not neutral here. Knowledge of terrible things, widely disseminated, thus makes those things stronger. The sealed vaults contain not just dangerous objects and entities, but dangerous ideas. And dangerous ideas in a universe where the psychic dimension is real and responsive to collective consciousness are not purely theoretical threats. This is why the Forbidden Vault's knowledge is described as capable of driving people insane, not just emotionally destabilizing, but literally psyche-breaking, because the things it knows are the kinds of things that, once known, change the structure of a person's relationship with reality in ways that human minds were not built to handle. The seal on a vault like that is partly physical and partly psychological. Keeping it closed keeps its contents from spreading in a specifically dangerous way. The sixth answer, and in some ways the most tragic, is that opening the vaults would require using them. The dark cells contain things that cannot be destroyed. They are there because the only options were containment or annihilation, and annihilation was not available. If someone opened those cells with the intention of extracting something useful, of weaponizing one of the imprisoned entities against, say, the Tyranid fleet or the Necron dynasties, they would be operating with a level of confidence in their ability to control those entities that the 10,000-year history of the Shadowkeeper's experience suggests would not be warranted. The things in the dark cells are not tools waiting to be picked up. They are things that found ways to survive in the universe, despite the best efforts of entities capable of opposing them. They are not going to be controllable by whoever decided they were willing to try. The seventh answer is the Emperor himself. The Golden Throne is the seal that cannot be opened. Keeping the Emperor on the throne, maintaining the psychic barrier against the webway, maintaining the Astronomicon, is the foundational priority of the entire Imperium. Every other sealed vault, every other protected archive exists within the context of that primary seal being maintained. If the throne fails, all the other seals become irrelevant because the resulting demonic flood would overwhelm the entire planet. The vaults are not independent systems. They exist within a hierarchy of containment, and the first level of that hierarchy, the one everything else depends on, is the Emperor's continued functioning. As this means that any action that might destabilize the Golden Throne, including actions that might seem operationally beneficial in the short term, has to be weighed against that foundational priority. Bringing a Dark Eldar homunculus onto Terra to repair the throne was a calculated risk that nearly went catastrophically wrong. Attempting to access the most sensitive vaults in the Imperial Palace would represent an even larger disturbance to a system that is already under maximum strain. The vaults are sealed in part because opening them is the kind of action that could tip a precarious situation into an unrecoverable one. And the eighth answer, the deepest one, is the one that echoes through the reference material in the voice of every organization and every individual who has ever had to make the decision to keep a door closed. We do not know what we would do with what is inside. The Imperium's institutions are not equipped to handle the truths that the deepest vaults contain. The ecclesiarchy cannot absorb the revelation that the original texts of the Imperial Creed differ significantly from the religion that has been built around them. The Adeptus Mechanicus cannot integrate knowledge of the men of iron into a functional worldview without tearing itself apart. The political structure of the High Lords of Terra cannot survive full knowledge of the dark cells becoming public. But the psychological infrastructure of an entire civilization built on faith and certainty and the narrative of the Emperor's divine protection cannot be maintained while simultaneously confronting the reality of what the Emperor is actually doing. The mechanical horror of the Golden Throne and the slow escalation of the Psyker sacrifice and the failing wards and the entities sealed in the depths below. The vaults are sealed, not because no one wants to know what is inside. The vaults are sealed because the Imperium of man, in its current state, cannot survive knowing. Part 11. The Great Rift and the Cracks in the Seal. Everything we have discussed exists in the context of a situation that was already at maximum strain before the event that defines the current era of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The formation of the Great Rift. As the galaxy-splitting warp storm that erupted when the forces of chaos finally achieved a critical threshold of power in the late 41st millennium, has changed the parameters of every calculation we have been examining. The Great Rift divided the galaxy in two. The Cicatrix Maledictum, as it came to be known, is a vast wound in the fabric of reality that runs roughly from one end of the Milky Way to the other, a region of permanent warp storm that makes travel through it extraordinarily dangerous and in many places impossible. The Astronomicon, already straining under the Golden Throne's deteriorating mechanisms, now has to push its light across a galactic rift that acts as a psychic barrier. The warp itself has become more turbulent, more hostile, are more prone to the kind of catastrophic events that make space travel and communication between Imperial worlds unreliable in ways they were not before. The effects on Terra's sealed vaults were direct and immediate. Several cells in the dark cells were discovered empty after the rift formed, their contents spirited away by forces that could not be detected or identified until after the fact. The things that escaped did not break through the physical locks or psychic wards. They simply were no longer there, as though the rift's formation had torn at the fabric of reality with enough force to pull them through from the outside, bypassing every layer of containment simultaneously. This has forced a fundamental reassessment. For 10,000 years, the containment model for the dark cells was built around the assumption that the wards and locks could hold indefinitely if properly maintained. The rift has demonstrated that there are scales of force that can simply invalidate that assumption. The cells that are still occupied may not remain occupied through the next comparable event. And the Great Rift is not going away. It is a permanent feature of the current galactic landscape, ongoing, churning, continuing to destabilize the warp in ways that will have consequences not yet fully apparent. The Shadowkeeper's response to this has been to send their warriors out into the galaxy for the first time in their history, hunting the escaped entities. This is a form of opening the vaults, in reverse. Instead of things getting out by having their doors opened, things are getting out by more catastrophic means, and the jailers are having to go after them. The Lock Warden's absence from Terra, his near-permanent state of being elsewhere in the galaxy, tracking and recovering escaped prisoners, is a sign of how significantly the calculus has shifted. Meanwhile, the surviving cells are still occupied, and still need to be guarded, with a shield host that is now significantly depleted because so many of its members are deployed elsewhere, chasing escaped prisoners. The margin of safety that was already thin is now thinner. The Golden Throne is still failing. The Adeptus Mechanicus still cannot repair it. The Dark Elder bargain bought some additional time, but the Inquisitor who examined the results estimated that delay was measured in centuries, not millennia. In the broader context of what we have been discussing, a few centuries is not very much time. The Great Rift has also had an interesting secondary effect on the broader question of sealed knowledge. The Imperium is facing threats of such severity that the normal calculus of suppression is under genuine pressure. The Indomitus Crusade, led by the Primarch Reboot Guilliman, the returned son of the Emperor, who now serves as Lord Commander of the Imperium, has forced a degree of pragmatism about information and resources that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The Shadowkeeper's decision to open a cell and provide technology to the Imperial Fists happened in this context. The earlier decision to approach the Dark Eldar about the Golden Throne happened in this context. The vaults are still sealed, but the doors are being looked at in ways they were not being looked at before. The question is no longer simply whether there is a reason to open them. The question has shifted to whether the reasons not to open them are still weighty enough to justify the risks of not opening them, in a galaxy where the stakes of getting things wrong have never been higher. There is a version of Warhammer 40,000 lore that suggests the sealed vaults will eventually have to be opened, not because anyone wants to open them, but because the alternative, watching the Imperium collapse under the weight of threats it cannot address with the resources it currently has access to, becomes worse than the risks of opening them. The Emperor himself may have planned for this, in the way that the Talisman of Seven Hammers represents a planned-for worst case. The idea that the Imperium's institutions, stripped down to their foundations, rebuilt from the ashes of what they were, might need to access things that were sealed away for very good reasons, but sealed away in a different era, under different circumstances, for a different version of humanity. That version of events is speculation, grounded in lore, but not yet confirmed. What is confirmed is that the vaults are sealed, that the reasons for sealing them are ancient and serious, and the product of genuine wisdom about genuinely terrible things, and that the situation in the 41st millennium is placing that wisdom under pressures it was never designed to withstand. Part 12. The weight of sealed things. There is a quality to all of this that is worth naming before we surface from these depths. It is a kind of deep, geological sadness that runs through the entire structure of what we have been examining, a sense of accumulated tragedy that is specifically and uniquely Warhammer 40,000 in its character. The sealed vaults on Terra are not, at their core, a mystery or a puzzle. They are a record of loss. Each sealed door represents something that could not be saved, could not be fixed, could not be destroyed safely, could only be managed. The dark cells contain things that were created by the worst period in human history and cannot be unmade. The Forbidden Vault contains knowledge that humanity generated through its own suffering and cannot be safely spread. The Vault of Origins contains a truth about itself that the Imperium cannot currently face without structural collapse. The Golden Throne contains a wound in the fabric of reality that has been held open by an act of will for 10,000 years, because the only way to close it properly was destroyed before it could be used. And running through all of it, present in everything we have looked at, is the Emperor himself, a being of extraordinary power and extraordinary vision who spent thousands of years trying to build something that would last, who built what he could while he was still able to act freely, and who has spent the last 10,000 years in a state of living death, unable to communicate except through the faintest psychic whispers, unable to act except through others, sealed as surely as anything in the vaults below him. The Emperor is, in a profound sense, the most important sealed vault on Terra. Maybe he contains knowledge that nobody alive can access. He contains memories of the age of strife, and the dark age of technology, and the wars of unification that no record has ever fully captured. He understands the nature of the webway and the Golden Throne and the things in the dark cells in ways that the custodians who guard him can only guess at. He has a plan, or had one, and whether that plan is still operational or has been overtaken by the events of 10,000 years since he was sealed into the throne, nobody knows. This is why the question of the sealed vaults is ultimately a question about the nature of the Imperium of man and what it is for. Is it a civilization capable of growth and change, and the kind of honest reckoning with its own history and its own limitations that would be required to actually engage with what is sealed in those depths? Or is it an institution so shaped by its own trauma and its own mythology that the only thing it can do with dangerous knowledge is seal it away and guard it indefinitely, hoping that the locks hold for another generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that. The 41st millennium offers no clear answer. The Great Rift has changed the parameters, but not resolved the fundamental tension. The vaults remain sealed. The Shadowkeepers maintain their vigil. The Golden Throne continues its slow deterioration. The Astronomicon still burns, fed by the lives of thousands of people per day, holding the darkness at bay for another year, another decade, another century. And somewhere in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, in corridors where light has not reached in 10,000 years, and where the air itself carries the memory of horrors no living person has witnessed, something waits. Not patiently, perhaps, not inertly, but contained. For now. If you have made it all the way down here with me, through all the layers of this genuinely remarkable corner of Warhammer 40,000 lore, I hope you feel what I feel every time I think about it. Not just the scale of the grimdark universe, not just the spectacle of it, but the real intellectual and emotional weight of a setting that has thought carefully about what it means to inherit a broken world and try to keep it together with willpower and sacrifice, and the desperate hope that the things you have sealed away will stay sealed long enough for someone to figure out what to do about them. The sealed vaults of Terra are one of the most quietly profound elements in the entire setting, because they are not primarily about monsters or battles or dramatic reveals. They are about knowledge, and about the costs of not knowing, and about the specific kind of courage that is required to stand in front of a door that you will never open and guard it anyway, because the alternative is worse than you can fully imagine, even having stood near enough to sense what is on the other side. Oh, thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. If you found value in this exploration, please consider subscribing to Caillou on 40K for more deep dives into the lore that makes this universe what it is. There is always more to find when you are willing to go looking. And if you have thoughts, questions, things I missed or got wrong, or things you want to explore further, the comments are waiting for you. This is the kind of topic that rewards exactly that kind of conversation. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and watch out for anything in a black robe standing very still in a very long corridor.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.